continue looking at solving quadratic equations, but we're going to be looking at these two different forms, but following the same basic process that we looked at last lesson. So again, we're going to be looking at the null factor law. Just remember that that just tells us when we've got two numbers that multiply together to give us 0, then one of them is 0 or potentially both of them are 0. And remember, these are the steps that we're going to follow to solve these equations, but today we are going to do that first step, factorizing the equation. So our first example here says solve x squared plus 6x, that's supposed to be is equal to 0. And we need to factorize, follow this step 1, factorize the equation first. So we can see when we look at the left-hand side of this equation, x squared plus 6x, we can take out the common factor of x at the front. And what we're left with inside the bracket is x plus 6. Yep. From here, we can use our null factor law, look at step 2, where it says equate each factor to 0. And we can say that either x is equal to 0 or x plus 6 is equal to 0. That first one, x equals 0, is already solved. Let's look at the second one here. X plus 6 is equal to 0. Subtract a 6 from both sides. That means x is equal to negative 6. Step 4, to state our solution. Therefore, x is equal to 0 or negative 6. Now let's go ahead and check our solution. So let's go off to the side here and do a quick check. Remember to check both of them. So sub equals 0 into our equation. Side is x squared plus 6x. So we've got 0 squared plus 6 times 0, which is 0, which is our right-hand side. So that's good. Let's check our second solution. Sub x equals negative 6 into our equation. Our left-hand side, x squared plus 6x, is negative 6 squared plus 6 times negative 6, which gives us negative 6 squared is 36. 6 times negative 6 is negative 36. 6 plus negative 36 is the same as 36 minus 36, which is 0. Second example. Here we've got 12x is equal to 3x squared. Now, when I look at this, the first thing I think is this does not look like I can use the null factor law, right? The null factor law has to be something multiplied by something is equal to 0. And that's why it's called the null factor law, null meaning 0. So we need to make sure that that right-hand side is 0 first. And what we need to do to make this right-hand side 0 is subtract a 3x squared, just do some rearranging from both sides. Once we subtract a 3x squared from both sides, those are going to cancel out, and we're going to end up with 0 on the right-hand side. And the left-hand side is negative 3x squared plus 12x. Now it looks more like the null factor law, right? We've got an equal to 0, so we can look at step 1, factorize the equation. Remember, with factorizing an equation, we want to take something out the front of some brackets, take out a common factor, and then equate those to 0. So when we look at these two terms, negative 3x squared and 12x, I can see that the number that they have in common, their common factor number is negative 3, or positive 3, but taking out a negative is nice. And in terms of the variables, we can see that they both have an x in common. So inside the brackets, what we're left with once we've taken out a negative 3x from the first term is just x. When we take out a negative 3x from the second term, we need to be careful with the sign here. A negative times a negative will give us a positive, which is what we want. And 3 times 4 is the number we need to get 12. If you're not sure about this process or you're not sure that you're doing it right, just go off to the side, expand it back out, make sure you get what you started with. But now that we've factorized it, we can go ahead and use the null factor law, and we can say that we know that two things multiply to give us 0, so either the first one is 0 or the second one is 0. For this first one here, negative 3x is equal to 0. We want x by itself, so we divide both sides by negative 3. These cancel out, and we're left with x is equal to 0. On the right-hand side, we've got x, take away 4 is equal to 0. So add 4 to both sides, we get x is equal to 4. Last step, before we state our solution, we've got 0 or 4. So let's go ahead and check this, because this was quite a long process. So let's have a look at a check. Remember, to check, what we want to do is substitute our solutions back in. So we want to substitute x is equal to 0. That's our first solution. What we have on the left-hand side is 12x. Right, so 12 times 0. 12 times 0 is 0. Now let's look at the right-hand side. I'm going to go over here and do it because I'm scared I'll run out of space. The right-hand side was 3x squared, so 3 times 0 squared, which is 3 times 0, which is 0. Right, so that's good. Our left-hand side is equal to our right-hand side, so x equals 0 works as a solution. Let's look at the second one. Hopefully it works. Because remember, one of them could work and the other one could very well not. So sub x equals 4 into our equation, do the same thing. The left-hand side is 12 times x, so 12 times 4 is 48. The right-hand side over here is 3x squared, so 3 times 4 squared. 4 squared is 16, and 3 times 16 is 48. So again, our left-hand side is equal to our right-hand side, which means I want you to pause the video at this point because I've gone through 2 examples and I want you to try these questions from the work plan. All right, the last couple of examples. We've got a new form here, and this one's actually pretty straightforward. But I am going to show you 2 different methods of doing this because we want to use the Null Factor Law, but there's also a method that is quite intuitive as well. And we've actually looked at this method before. Okay, so think back to Pythagoras when we had lots of squared things and we were solving for side lengths. Our first method, I want to follow that same sort of Pythagoras process. So we've got x squared is equal to 25. If a number squared is equal to 25, then that number is 5, isn't it? X is equal to the square root of 25, which is 5. Yep, 5 squared gives us 25, so this works. But you might recall me saying earlier in the year, there is another solution that works. And it's because when we square something, it's always positive, right? Think about the number -5. If we square -5 times -5, we also get positive 25, right? So -5 is also a solution. So this is a symbol that might be new to you. Plus minus is how we read that, right? It's 2 solutions. It's positive 5, but it's also -5. So there are 2 solutions. X could either be positive 5 or -5. Our second method, and we will check this solution at the end, but our second method, I'll just write over here, is using the Null Factor Law. Okay, and remember again that the Null Factor Law has to be equal to 0 on the right-hand side. So let's quickly rearrange this. If we've got x squared is equal to 25, then x squared, subtract 25 from both sides. X squared subtract 25 is equal to 0. Yep. Think back to way back at the beginning of the year when we did something called difference of 2 squares or difference of perfect squares. What we had was when we have 2 squared things, right? Something squared, subtract something squared. We can factorize that to be 1 plus 1 minus x 5. Yep, x plus 5, x minus 5 is equal to 0. If you're not convinced about this, expand it back out and make sure that you got what we started with. Okay, so now we've got what we're very familiar with seeing. A bracket times a bracket is equal to 0. We factorize the equation. We want to use the Null Factor Law now to equate each of these factors to 0. So we know that either x plus 5 is equal to 0 or x take away 5 is equal to 0. Solve each of those. If x plus 5 is equal to 0, then x is equal to negative 5. X minus 5 is equal to 0, x is equal to 5. You'll see that no matter which method you use, you end up with the same thing, right? You end up with two solutions, one positive and one negative. Let's go through and very quickly check that these solutions work. So, check. Okay, substitute first value in. I guess it doesn't really matter which one is the first one, but x is equal to positive 5. The left-hand side is equal to x squared, 5 squared, which is 25, which is our right-hand side. So that's a good solution. Second solution, sub x equals negative 5 into the equation. The left-hand side is now negative 5 squared, which is 25, which is again our right-hand side. So that solution also works. Let's look at our very last one. Now this one I'm only going to use one method, but you are free to use whichever method you would like to use. I personally like method 1 a little bit better. So actually I'm going to get rid of these steps because we're not using the null factor. So if we're solving this equation for x, we just want to get x by itself, right? So we want to go through and do some of our inverse operations. I'm just going to use a different color for this. So we want to get rid of the 24 first. This is negative 24. We want to add 24 to both sides. When we add 24 to both sides, we end up with 8x squared is equal to 24. Our next inverse operation that we need to do is to get rid of the 8, and to do that we need to divide both sides by 8. When we divide both sides by 8, the 8 disappears from the left-hand side, and we're left with x squared is equal to 3. Now to solve this, to solve an x squared is equal to anything, our inverse operation for squared is the square root. So we need to take the square root of both sides, but we also need to remember the plus minus. We know there are going to be two solutions that when we square it, we get 3. Yeah. So we have that x is equal to plus minus the square root of 3. We can't go any further than this because 3 is not a perfect square. So we can't actually take the square root of it and get a nice number. And that's our solution. Our two numbers are positive square root of 3 and negative the square root of 3. Now let's do a check, because square roots are always a little bit funny. Let's check the positive value first. Sub x equals 3 into the equation. The side is 8 times x squared, right? So times root 3 squared, subtract 24.